All right. Well, welcome everybody back to, I think this is what, the last day of the Perl conference this year. Probably getting tired, so let's just try to make it fun. I want to welcome everybody who's watching this on YouTube. And if you get something out of it, please consider donating to Perl. So my name is John Napiorkowski. I'm JNap on IRC. And on CPAN, you can find me under JGAN API Yeah, anyway, there it is. And this is a presentation on Valiant, which is a form validation system, which I wrote because there were just not enough of them on CPAN. So what's the outline of the presentation today? I'm going to talk a little bit about what Valiant is, why I wrote it. I'm going to give you some examples, a detailed code walkthrough, and hopefully we'll get to talk about the glue code that I wrote for the DBIX class. So you can glue the validations DBIX class with a Catalyst application. And as far as we get. And just to point out, I mean, I wrote a lot of slides here, but feel free to, if something that's interesting, you want to stop me. I mean, if I only get through half the slides or a third of the slides because people have questions, I'm fine with that. I have no particular agenda to force our way through everything. So you're all pro programmers, so let us just start with the code. What does Valiant look like? Well, it looks like this. Basically, Valiant adds a domain-specific language, basically a couple keywords that get pulled into your Moo or Moose classes. It works with both Moo and Moose. All the examples that you'll see today I wrote it will be Moo, but Moose also works. So the idea here is that we add a couple of keywords. In this case, you see here the two keywords that we'll be reviewing: validate and validates with. And with these two additional keywords, it allows you to add validations into any existing Moo or Moose class. And they're just simply defined using a process that works very similar to the way that Moo and Moose works with defining attributes. So it should be pretty straightforward and fit into hopefully the way you think about things. Okay, so as I said, it's a DSL for tagging Moo and Moose objects. And the goal here is, there's like probably 1,000 different ways of doing validation on CPAN. And a lot of the libraries that are out there are really great. But what I wanted something that was very specifically to make it very easy to write objects that express your business logic validations. There's a lot of stuff out there that's specifically for writing HTML forms or doing form validation. There's a lot of standalone validations. There's constraint systems. But what I was looking for is something that would fit into existing classes and help me to just put validations on top of it. Additionally, what I wanted was something that I can glue into DBIX class. I use DBIX class a lot for doing data persistence, and like 90% of my code, particularly my business logic code, is written into DBIX class. So I wanted something that would fit into that very straightforwardly. And there would be a couple utilities that would overlap with validation. Internationalization of your error messages and filtering being two. I'm not going to go into super detail in those in this presentation because we only have 50 minutes, and each one is a pretty deep subject in and of itself. But I added both of these because in my review of many of the popular validation systems on CPAN, it looked like that most of them had filtering and many of them had internationalization built in. So it seemed to be something that people expect to have. And what I mean by filtering, I mean when the information comes in before performing validation, maybe you want to do some munging of the data. You want to trim it to remove white space from the beginning to the end. Maybe you want to normalize the capitalization, strip out any evil attempts to do HTML or JavaScript type injection, all those kind of things. So you basically munging the data before doing validation. And just simply what it's not, out of scope for Valiant. It's not a form builder, so it's not like a direct replacement for, say, something like HTML form foo or data form foo. Those which are systems that do validation, but they will also generate HTML. Okay. And it's not a standalone validation system. So it's not like something like Data Validator, where you create a class that expresses a bunch of validations, and then you can run, basically run those against like hash refs, okay? This is something that needs to be built into Moo or Moo's classes, okay? So it's a little more heavyweight, but it's designed to work inside of existing classes. Okay, and just a quick disclaimer, it's on CPAN. I've been using it, other people have been using it. I still consider the code to be, most of the code is late beta, but some parts of the code, particularly the DBIX class stuff that I show you, I consider to be alpha. So like what I mean by alpha is it works for me, but if you use it, you really should be somebody who knows who knows Perl and would be willing to like submit bug reports and possibly even patches to me if you run into trouble. Okay, so let's go to the top and start with a very simple validation example. All right, so going back to here. So here we have a Moo class. It defines two attributes, age and name, and the data comes in and we want to validate it, okay? So the most simple thing you could possibly do using Valiant is to just use a code ref with validates with. Validates with accepts the existing instance that you're validating. So self here is an instance of local simple, and you just simply add error messages based on things not working the way you want, right? So this basically is a validation that operates on the instance as a whole, okay? So I just defined two validations. I want the name to be under a certain length, and I want the age to be over a certain number, okay? And I'm just simply defining here, I'm specifying which of the attributes has the problem. So age can't be negative, name can't be too long. Now and then I go ahead and I create an instance of a class that's invalid. Okay, so one thing that I just want to pause and go through very quickly. In Valiant, I distinguish between well-formed and valid, right? So when something is well-formed, that means that the document can be created, can be read, right? Whereas valid means that the document is hitting the expectations, the specification that you've given for the class. So in other words, just to go back to the example, I'm able to actually create, with the data given, an instance of local simple, right? So that means that it's well formed. I can actually validate. So the easy way to understand the difference is if something is well formed, if it's not well formed, it's completely broken and you can't do validation at all, right? So that's like, just give an example. Let's say you're validating data coming in from some web forms, right? Or you're validating data that's coming in via a JSON post. If the data is well formed, that means that it's got the attributes set up in the expected places. If it's not well formed, it means that it's not. For example, if you're looking for JSON, maybe they didn't post JSON, they posted something else. In other words, you can't read it. So you can't, it's not well formed, you cannot even do validation at all. You just basically have to say, sorry, I can't do anything, broken, right? Whereas in the case of something that's simply invalid, it means that it is a possible situation that you want to help the user work through. So like going back to the example, in the case where somebody gives an age that's too low, you don't want to just simply break and say, sorry, can't proceed. You would like to give your user client some sort of information to help them fix the mistake they made, okay? And you can do that because the data that was given was well formed. You could process it. So again, an invalid doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that the object is in a state that is beyond expectation, but you're able to understand it and inform the client what they need to do to fix the mistake they made. And just again, going to here, this is the example of the class and the kind of error messaging that Valiant would help you to create. So when you use Valiant, it adds a bunch of methods to your class: validate, valid, invalid, and then of course it gives you an errors object and a lot of different ways to look at the errors and parse them and pull them out and do stuff with them. But this is just a simple example of the errors that you would get with the class that we just gave. I want to pause here for a moment and see if there's any questions. Okay, so it's making your, quite often when you're validating, it's important to validate against the class as a whole, but quite often your validation logic is associated with the attributes on your Moo or Moose class, right? And you would like to have some sort of mechanism for reusability and to break up your logic to make it easier to test. When you have this, all the logic is in one big code ref. It's probably okay when you only have two, but you get to the point where you have like 50 or 60, it gets to be a little too much in one place. So what you would like to have is the ability to break it up and say not only do validation per attribute, but also we want some mechanism to allow us to have reusability, right? And parameterization. So this is just an example of moving toward having that type of reusability and parameterization. So instead of just declaring a subref and adding it onto the validation, I'm referencing a subroutine and I'm sending parameters, right? So in this first example, for name, we're expecting the name should be no more than 20 characters, right? So we define a method for that. We add errors and so forth if the parameter is violated. And we have a similar thing for the age as well. So this is like a small baby step toward like better reusability. We have reusable methods, it's parameterized, and we're doing separate validations on your attributes rather than one big validation method for the entire class. And of course, once you start to parameterize and you start to break it up, your validates can accept more than one validation per call. So in this case, I might have some validations for name, like the check length one we looked at, and maybe I got some other methods, something that looks like a name. The name has to be unique in a database. I might do some sort of SQL lookup and so forth, right? So you can mix and match, have as many as you want. And of course, just like with Moo and Moose, if you have the validation check that's going to be applied to the same, it's going to be applied to multiple attributes, but it's the same one, you can just simply say in array ref, give all the attribute names and just simply declare it. So this is, I mean, you could declare them separately if you want. This is just a shorthand if you know they're all going to be the same. Right, now, so we keep talking about moving toward improved reusability. It's nice to be able to reference a method in your class, but quite often you want to be able to build validations that you can share across classes. So there's a couple ways to do this, but the way that's built in to Valiant is you can define a custom validator class. And a custom validator class, all that it is an object that has a validate method. I recommend that if you build your own, that you should consume the Valiant validator role, but that role, it doesn't really have much except that it enforces that you have the validate method. And so basically all that I've done here is I've created a custom validator, which is the same as that validator code ref that we had way back from the beginning. And let's see how we would use it in a class. So it's a little more reusable because you can use this across multiple classes. Now, we might have noticed the way we invoked the name. In order to make it easier to do subclassing and reusability, the validator class, I basically just look at the last part. So you can see here it says validates with custom. Just let's go back to the definition. And it's under the namespace of the class that you created it. So I'm looking in local person validator custom. The package is local person. And the way this lookup works is we basically start by looking in a namespace specific to the class you invoked it in. And then we just crawl up the namespaces until we get to the root namespace. After that, we look in two more. One is Valiant Validator X namespace, which is reserved for people who want to share validations on CPAN. And then there's the Valiant Validator namespace, which is reserved for validations which ship with Valiant. Okay, so to be clear, when you create the class, these we crawl at the load time. So it makes it a little longer for your class to get loaded. But once it's loaded, it knows what it's doing, so it doesn't have to look this up for every single instance. So this means that this validator is good only for persistent applications. So like a web application like Catalyst or Dancer or Modulicious that's running persistently could use this. I would not recommend using this for something like classic CGI, right? Where each time everything gets loaded and built up, because there's a performance penalty for the load time. During the load time, each class has to go look up all the validations, and it crawls the namespace like this. Any questions about that? Okay, if for some reason you have like a validator in a unusual namespace that you want to share, you can just write the entire class name and put a plus in front of it. And if you do that, then Valiant knows that means load this very specific thing, okay? So we just showed like how to write a custom validator that would operate on the class as a whole. But in general, we very often are doing validation at the attribute level. So how do you create a custom validator that would be reusable for your attributes? So here's an example. Now, these are validators which ship with Valiant. Valiant ships with a number of them. Presence just means that it needs to be there. It's basically like required. The numericality validator gives you a lot of different ways of enforcing that if it's a number. In this case, I'm specifying it needs to be an integer that's between 1 and 10. Okay, and the length validator validates the lengths of strings. So that means the description has to be at least 10 characters, but no more than 60. Okay. And the date validator, it has a number of options. In this particular case, I'm saying it must be a future date, right? These are all built in. And if you go to CPAN and look at the different validators that ship with it, each one is documented and gives you quite a few options out of the box. Okay. But how do you write your own custom validator? Again, it's actually pretty simple. Like with the custom validator that operates on the class, you just simply write a Moo class. And in this case, you need to consume the Valiant validator each, which is the subclass of Valiant, which is a subrole of Valiant validator that has extra stuff built into it to allow you to make it easy for you to validate attributes. And you can see here that the signature is a little different with validate each because you get the attribute name. You don't just get the incoming object, you get the attribute name, the value you're comparing with it, and the additional options that are being passed along, right? So in this particular case, here's a very simple example of validator, which is enforcing that an attribute must be considered true, Perl true, right? So if, as you can see, unless it's true, I'm saying it's not a true value, it's adding an error. You can from here, you can pretty much write any kind of validation. And the lookup works the same. Basically, it would look under it would start by, it would crawl the namespace, starting with the namespace in which you've called it, and it'll crawl up to the top of the namespace, and then it'll look in the two global namespaces. And this is an example of how you might use it in your class. So when I wrote this, I was looking at Ruby on Rails because originally this was a project. I ended up starting this project. Somebody said they wanted to pay me to port Ruby on Rails style validations to Perl. I worked on it for a while. They disappeared. I looked at the code about 2 years ago and said, maybe I should finish it. Seems like it would be useful and it wouldn't take long. And of course, 2 years later, here I am. Everything always takes longer than you think. So all the validations names are based on the same from Ruby on Rails. If you already know that, or you're bringing Rails people over to a Catalyst application or a Perl application, it'll seem familiar to them. So there's an upside to that, I guess. Okay, so there's a lot of different ways you can declare validations. You can do a subref. You can do subclasses of Valiant Validator, as I showed you. But you can also just simply use any of the standard validation type constraints that are on CPAN. A lot of people like type tiny, and this is an example of using type tiny. So you could just simply use it if you're familiar with it, or if you've written a bunch of like type tiny constraints for your projects, you can consume that as well. So Valiant tries to not be really dictatorial, and there's a lot of try to give you a lot of different ways to write your constraints depending on what you are used to using. Reusability. Whenever you write classes, you always want to try to think about making it so that you don't have a lot of repeated code, and thinking about in terms of reusing and having shared bits. So it's very easy to use roles. You could just simply create a new class, like here we create a person class. It defines some validations for both name and age. And this is an actual class. And now here's an example of creating a role. So is retirement age. It adds an additional validation on a required method, on required attribute age, right? And then here we have, and at the very end, we actually have a concrete class that is using person. So it has name and age, and it's consuming is retirement age. So it picks up the additional validation from the is retirement age. And when we go to use it, we'll see that the errors happen the way as expected. Now, there's a lot of different options in order to try to give you better control over how your validations run and when they run under certain conditions. So you can slip in these global options. They can be either associated with all the validations that are being defined on a given attribute, or you can put them on a very specific one. Okay, so here we go with allow undef is a validation option that says you want to skip the validation if the actual attribute isn't defined. So a lot of times you may only want to do validation if the data is actually there, right? As opposed to generating an error, or you don't care, like something is optional. You don't want to generate an error if something's optional. So here we have name, which if it's present, it's required to be alphanumeric and a length between 30 and 20. But if there's no name, if somebody is anonymous, we don't run those validations at all, and we don't generate any of the errors. Okay, and you see here that allow undef applies to both length and format. Now, with the next validation, you can see that the allow undef is grouped in with the options that are specific to the numericality validation, right? So this one is only, this allow undef is only associated with that one specific validation. So for example, if you had multiple validation on age and you only want to skip some when it's undefined, you could do that. Allow blank is similar to undefined, but it accepts blank.
JNAP, we've lost your audio.
Letter, depending on your use case. If unless, this allows you to control whether you run a validation based on some additional logic. Okay, so down here we're saying that a password needs to be between 12 and 32 characters, and it needs to look like a secure password, unless it's me. I'm allowed to have any kind of password I want. And you could use this as a mechanism for controlling which validations run under what circumstances. Now, you've seen that we give you default messages, which are defined and internationalized. But there's a lot of different ways to set error messages. One simple way is to just set a message on the validation as to what I want, and as a string, and this will be the error message. So this, it can actually be complicated because it can take a string, it can take a code ref, and it can take a translation tag. I'm not going to go into super detail there. It's documented, but you have a lot of different ways of controlling and presenting the way your messaging works. There's another option called strict, which basically, generally, when you fail a validation, you don't want to throw an exception, right? What you're trying to do is you're collecting a list of things that are wrong that you want to tell somebody how to correct. That's what the error messages are. But there's some cases where you might want to actually, like if something is particularly bad, you want to just simply throw an exception and kill the code at that point. A scenario like that might be if you detect that a string contains SQL injection or HTML injection type attacks, then perhaps you just, you want to stop there because you no longer trust the incoming data at all if it looks like it's some sort of an attack. And on allows you to specify a context in which the validation actually runs, right? So here's a scenario where I've defined a attribute called age, and I'm going to require that it's greater than or equal to different ages, depending on the context in which the validation is run, right? So if it's run in the voter context, you have to be at least 18. For right to retiree, it's got to be 65. I guess that's 66 here in the U.S. now, and for people that are over 100 context. And how does that look? When you call the validate method, you pass the context, and it will match the incoming context to the, just to go back, to the on specification that you gave. This can be really useful in scenarios where you need to slightly parameterize your validation and have the validation be different depending on the circumstances. You could, of course, always write an entire new class. And it's what I actually would recommend doing if your context change is significant. But sometimes you have a very small change, and this just gives you the ability to not have to write an entire new class just for minor differences in your validation rules. So the way the validation works is that if a validation specifies an on, then that must match at least one of the items given in the context, which is passed to validate. Okay, so if you say on, it has to match. If your validation does not specify an on, then it will match any context given or none, right? So in other words, for validations that always run all the time, no matter what context, you simply say none. And I don't have an example of it here, but you are allowed to set an array of contexts, and you're allowed to set an array for on as well. So it gives you quite a few options. Error message retrieval. So there's a lot of different ways that you can parse and look at error messages. I'm just going to show a couple quick things here. So like say you create a bunch of error messages that look like the code up top. And you would just simply want to get all of them in a big list. You can just get them in a big list, and it'll return an array of all the error messages. Now, just so you could see one difference here, you haven't seen this before, but this very top error message declaration where I'm saying add undef. Now, generally, when you add an error message, you're adding one of two different types of error messages. Either it's an error message that's associated with a specific attribute, in which case you'll specify the attribute, like this second one here, add name, name is too short. Okay, that's an error message that's associated with the name attribute. But sometimes you have error messages that are associated with the object as a whole. Okay, in that case, you simply say add undefined. In other words, there's no attribute to which this error message is associated. Okay, and you can pull up those messages separately by looking at the model messages, or if you want to just look at attribute messages, or if you want to just pull up error messages for a specific attribute. There's like 20 methods to the errors class. It allows you to parse error messages in lots of different ways. These are the most common use cases, but there's a lot there to do with it. And obviously, I'm always willing to take feedback and patches. So because I don't have like hours and hours, a couple things that we just didn't cover but are out there, and you can look them up in the Valiant documentation. You can do nested data as well as arrays. There's ability to do internationalization, and of course I mentioned filtering. It's a little off topic from this, but all those features are there, and I'm going to cover nested a bit when we look at the DBIx class stuff, but I'm not going to cover it here. But it's there and documented. And of course, if you're using DBIx class and get into trouble, you can set the environment variable Valiant debug with a number from 1 to 4. Higher the number gives you more debugging output. And it gives you a lot of debugging as to exactly what it's doing. So if you're having trouble figuring out why a validation isn't running the way you expected, setting Valiant debug can usually help you figure it out. Okay, so let's see, what time is it? All right, we're not doing too bad. So we can talk about gluing Valiant to DBIx class. This was like actually the main reason why Valiant was written, was to be able to have it here. So it was a lot of work just to get to this point. So we're going to do I actually have a live demo for this. And let me stop there so that this live demo, the code for this is actually in the DBIx class. I'm sorry, it's actually in the Valiant CPAN module. There's an example directory. So let's see. Do share screen on the right thing here. So give me a second. Oh, here we go. Guess I have to do this, huh? All right, you all seeing my browser and some code and stuff?
Yes.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so this looks like in DBIx class. I just built a very simple web application. registration form. This is the kind of thing you might do all the time. So let me just show you what it looks like when from the browser. Now, I didn't actually make these password types so you can actually see the data. So let me run it. And you're getting some error messages. So how does this all work? Let's first look at the DBIC class result set that register is backing. Okay, so there's a class, there's a person class of which you're trying to register. And the validations are set as class methods on the result source class. Now it also supports DBIC Candy, and we'll take a quick look at that if we get to the end of this, which makes everything look a lot neater. But for the purposes of this example, I'm sticking with the default syntax that you get out of the box with DBIC class, which I know looks a lot like the late 90s, but this is where we are with it. So again, I'm just simply defining a validates method and specifying, is this big enough? Do I make it bigger, or can you all see it?
I'd go one notch bigger.
One notch bigger? How's that?
Thank you.
Okay, so again, I have a validate method. I'm validating the username. I'm saying present. It needs to be present. It needs to be of a length between 3 and 24. It needs to be alphanumeric. These are all things that are built in, come with Valiant, and unique. This is actually built into the DBIC glue, and it's actually just like a dumb lookup. It's pretty much the dumbest possible thing. It just does a select, which means it's not performant, and you probably need to write your own unique lookup class if you're doing anything real. But out of the box, you get something that works. And these are just additional validations. One thing that we do is, remember I mentioned contexts. The DBIC class glue for Valiants automatically sets an update or create context, depending on whether you're creating or updating the row. So you can use that in your code, okay? So in this case here, I'm doing a confirmation only on update, only when the column is changed. When I'm creating, I'm always doing it because you need to have a password in order to create a user. And these are just other validations. The catalyst code for this is actually pretty simple. This is the part about it that I like the most because you don't have to do a lot. All I'm simply doing here is, and I'll never do this. I'm just doing this for demo, but I'm just passing the raw parameters directly to new. This is actually a security mistake. You really need to whitelist your incoming parameters. But again, I just wanted to make it simple for demo purposes, but so I should add a note here, never do this. So that nobody copies it. And the way this works is, when you do insert an update on a DBIC class that is consuming Valiant, what it will do is it will run validation. If the validation passes, it goes ahead and does the insert or create. If it fails, it does not do the insert or create, okay? But it does actually leave the model set up the way you created it, so that way you can use it for display. And here I'm simply saying, I should have said if model, probably would have been better to say if model valid. I'm just checking if it's in storage, because if it's in storage, that means that it was created, which means that it worked, right? So if it works, I'm going to redirect to the login page. If it doesn't work, then I'm going to go to the register template. My template system here is just based on the template systems you get with Modulicious, because it's basically pure Perl. So I wanted to make it simple so that Perl programmers would understand it. But there's not a lot here either. I just have a helper here that just displays the error messages if there are any error messages. So you'll only get here if it fails, right? So there's actually not a ton of work that needs to be done. It's a nice, neat, thin controller. All right, so let's make one that's good. And then I still got a few minutes left. Let's look at something a little more fun and perhaps closer to the bleeding edge of the code. So let me create something. I think I'm up to JGN 15. 15. And I didn't put any sort of complicated confirmation password logic here just to make it easy. Obviously, you would not want to let somebody make a password that looks this dumb. So we got to the logic because it validated. I did an insert, and then it validated, so it passed. And now we're redirected to the login, right? So let's log on. Okay, so you're logged in. Let's look at profile. Profile is a little more complicated. So basically, under the profile, this is a demonstration of using nested stuff with DBIX class and the Valiant glue. So here, let me just go back to the class, to the result set. So the person table has some related bits, right? It has an optional profile, which is a 0 to 1. You can have some credit cards associated with person, 1 or more, and they can have some roles, okay, that are associated with the person. So there's basically an optional 1 to 1, has many, and an additional has many with a bridge to many, okay? And just going back to here, I'm going to set some validations. I'm saying that the profile has a validation. It's a result because it's a 1 to 1. I'm going to allow blanks, and I want to process my validations. I'm going to process the validations nested. So now we need to look at profile. What is profile doing? Let's just quick look at that. So profile has a bunch of additional fields, their address, their birthday, et cetera, and I've placed some validations on that, right? So in other words, when we go into here, what we want to be able to do is, when we add the data, we want the validation to go down into this related class and to gather all the errors and show them, okay? Same thing goes with the roles and credit cards. And we'll look at that in a moment. Well, we don't have a moment, so we'll just look at it quick. So what happens if I just try to update the profile? Now, just by the way, this could explode because this is like work in progress code. So if it does, you can all laugh at me. Anyway, it took the incoming form and processed the validations through all the associated classes. So it started at person, okay, found these pieces were valid, and then went down into profile, found a bunch of missing bits, okay, and gave you all these errors. So let's go a little further. Let's add a credit card. Now I'm just adding some blanks. Let's add some stuff here so that we're getting somewhere. I'm not doing really any complicated validation on the credit card. Just here. Again, this was just done for demo, so that's nothing super complicated. And let's validate this and see how far we get. Well, we got further. It's telling us some more bits. The profile is still invalid because the birthday doesn't look like a date. Now you could have put these, I could have put these error messages next to the fields as well. It's just a little more work, obviously. I wanted to make this simple for demo purposes. And it's telling me that one of my credit cards expiration must be in the future. So this one here is year 2000, it needs to be in the future. So let's put this in the future. And let's add a birthday. And so this one was created. Now,
JNAP, you've
go
got
ahead.
8 minutes until a hard stop if you want to think about Q&A or closing.
I only got 1 or 2 slides left anyway. So let's finish. So thank you for giving me the heads up. Just to go into a little detail here, the nested support, I still think is a little bit beta because it works with both create and update, but it probably could use some more examples of things. Like you can generate errors, like say I try to remove the roles, you have to have at least 1 role, and all this stuff is defined specifically within the validations that you specify as declarations. So I'm just going to leave it at that. So I guess we'll move on real quick. I would love for people to play with this, particularly the nested stuff, because the more error reports I get, the more I can actually fix things. Let's stop this and go back to the presentation if I can do it. I guess I gotta move this to the same, right? That's not what I wanted. Where's my cursor? Am I sharing?
You see it.
Okay. So just real quick, there's a couple of things before DBIC can be considered version 1. I need more docs. I need people to play with it. Please do. I did mention that you can declare your validations as using the keywords like validates and validates with, but you can also just add a validates option to your attributes. Some people might find this neater. And you can do the same thing with the DBIx class. So you can put the validations as you can see here, as a field directly within your add columns, right? So if you don't like the look of like all the extra like declarations, if this looks neater to you, then you can take this approach. And lastly, the DBIx class stuff works with DBIx class Candy. It's set up to work with that, so you can use that as well. You might find this more attractive. So looks like I'm basically right on time. If anybody loves this and uses it and makes money with it, I would love for people to consider donating to their local shelter. This module is dedicated to the memory of one of my dogs. Questions? I can't see anybody, so I can't call out anybody specifically. If nobody has any questions, you can always catch up with me on IRC. You can hit me up on Catalyst or DBIx class or any of the places. There's no dedicated channel to Valiant. Since it was sort of built to work with DBIx class. Most of the people that are using it tend to hit me up there. So feel free.
Have you had any situation where you have notable performance implications from the use of this framework?
I'm sorry, performance implications?
Yeah, did it ever slow you down in a way that was annoying to you?
It hasn't hit me with that, but I'm going to be really clear. The code here has not been performance optimized in any way. My goal was to get it feature complete and working like stable 100%, and then do optimizations afterwards.
Gotcha.
Okay. So yeah, look, the more you do, it does create a lot of objects. So there's that. But you're going to have to write validation logic anyway. So whether it's slower or faster than others, I really can't comment.
That's also a good point. I wasn't thinking about that. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're going to have logic, it's going to, you know, it's going to be somewhere. It's always going to run. I find that a lot of the validations, particularly for the complex stuff, like that hits the database, doing smart things like caching results and preloading data does a lot. Like, for example, for the uniqueness check, instead of doing like a database lookup every single time, which is like dumb. I mean, that'll work with like low volume, but you're going to get to a point where that's going to kill you, right? Maybe like persisting your usernames into like a dedicated memcache store, and doing lookups there instead might be an optimization. I think for that kind of thing, the optimizations are going to be more complicated. Thank you, Bruce. Anybody else got questions?
I have a question.
Cool.
So I wonder, for Moose, does it use the attribute accessors, the methods, or does it use the internal hashref?
Did we get kicked? Hello?
Hello?
I heard his question. Can you not hear his
Okay.
question?
I heard part of it. So when I wrote this, I wanted it to work with Moo. So it's not really using any of the cool meta stuff that's built into Moose. It was just a decision that I made. I wanted it to be more broadly compatible. I would certainly love it if Perl would have like objects built into it with like good meta framework, so that I wouldn't have to do all these like crazy code things in order to write code that works across like a bunch of different object systems, because we as a community can't figure out what we want. It's annoying, but it's where we are. Did I answer the question properly?
The question was a bit different. I was asking about the implementation. Does it use Moose's accessors, the methods that are used to access the data, or does it use the internal hashref that Moose uses to store the data in?
Yeah, I mean, it hits the accessor. Okay. Actually, there's even an abstraction layer around that. There's a method called get attribute for validation, and you can go look at the role that builds all this stuff, so that you could actually override it. But by default, it just hits the method that gets generated by the attribute. So might there be some bugs here if you're doing like the attribute and then defining readers and writers and stuff? It's possible, yeah. If you run into bugs like that, please submit bug requests, and I will figure it out.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you, JNat. Thank you for presenting, and that's all the time we have on this channel.
Cool. Well, thanks to everybody for showing up. Another shout out to anybody who's watching on YouTube. Consider donating to Perl, please, if you value this. And again, to anybody in the future watching this, I hope you're not sitting in an apocalypse bunker somewhere, warming yourself by the glow of, I don't know, pig crap or something. I have to say that because in the last year, we all know
Yeah.
it can happen. Anyway, thank you, everybody.